The reemergence of Hasidism in the Solomon lineage is a reemergence of the channel, right? Of the prophet. And actually, you can begin to trace all over the world the beginning of the reemergence of these voices, these channel voices. And they're important voices, but they need to be clarified. So thank you for the beautiful opening. Christo, is just a delight to be with you and to feel you and to chant together. Thank you, Christina Amelon, for a very important and beautiful Dharma recapitulation. And just to remind all of us, the reason we do Dharma recapitulation, and Krista's done it, stunningly for quite a while, is to capture, and Christina takes particular sentences from the Dharma, the study that we did the previous week, and then tries to weave direct quote sentences into a tapestry recapitulating. And it's very much like the recapitulation in music. Precise segments, flavored, animated by the unique self-presence and taste of Amelonness, right? Because the Dharma, or the new story of the value, or the universal grammar of value, as a context for our diversity that we're trying to articulate here in response to the metacrisis, moves through each of us uniquely and specifically and individually, not just through our traumas and through our contractions, right? Through our separate self beauty and distortion, but also when we clarify our channel, when we clarify our interior, then the story of value, then value itself, then wisdom, then gnosis, then dharma, if you will. The Tao, Torah, wisdom, spirit moves through us in an entirely different way. And so to enter into one mountain and to kind of tap into spirit, dharma, Tao, gnosis, moving through Krista as she chants, because chanting is a methodology for clarifying the channel. And we're going to talk about what the channel means in a moment. And as Christina Amelon does in her life, the work that she does, just like Krista does, just like I do, just like all of us need to do, we do work to clarify the channel. And then when the Dharma, the Torah, the Gnosis, the Tao, the wisdom comes through Christina Amelon in the Dharma recapitulation, right? Then it's flavored by, it has the fragrance of Amelonness. And the same thing's true for David, or for Jacqueline, or for Shahat, right? Or for KK, right? That's the nature of, for Zohar, right? Just mentioning Jamie, right? Benjamin, right? All of us. So what we want to talk about today is this notion of channel. So I am traveling, and I'm in Sedona, right? I would show you, let's see if you can see. Tell me if you can see. Can you see outside? Anybody? Can you see? No? Yes? I guess that was a no. Could anyone see? Yes. Okay. So I'm in Sedona, and I'm here for 4.5 days on a kind of intense schedule. I'm here with my very, very close student, friend, interlocutor, partner, who's the board chair of the Center for World Philosophy and Religion, Aubrey Marcus. And we're here for a bunch of reasons. And one of them is an encounter that Aubrey convened, right, for a while back, right, between, if you will, the Dharma, the wisdom of Solomon, the interior sciences, the new story of value, cosmorotic humanism, that we're telling in response to the metacrisis in this time between worlds and time between stories, and a second world that Aubrey has been deeply committed to, which is the world of channels. Now, the world of channeling. And he invited down here to spend time with me, a kind of group of people. So there's kind of a group of 15 people who are all, musicians and artists and, entrepreneur kind of people, together with myself and with Paul Selig. And Paul is a beautiful man and a well-known kind of medium, not medium, wrong word, channel, a well-known channel. And he channels, Paul's guides. He's been doing it for several decades. Paul was a university professor for 25 years and taught playwriting at New York University at NYU, and kind of ran the playwriting department also at a progressive college called Goddard College in Vermont, and actually not far from the center, from the location of, the home, the Center for World Philosophy and Religion. We have an actual center in Vermont. And so Paul was deep in the academic world, and then for, many years kind of did channeling sessions in his living room because he didn't want to go public with it. He didn't want to, ruin, as it were, his academic reputation. And at a certain point, right, he began publicly moving in this realm. And, as his friend and teacher, asked me, so what do you think about this? Like, what's the relationship of this new story of value, of these first principles and first values that, Marc, you're saying is so central in response to the metacrisis? How does this relate to the world of channeling? And what do those two things have to do with each other? That's an important question. It's an important question. So, we decided a while back, we hadn't seen each other in a long time, and we wanted to do a kind of deep visioning, right? From a kind of board chair perspective, right? And Aubrey's the co-board chair with Kathleen J. Brownback, right? They serve together, and Kathy and I are involved, deeply, with our vice chair, Christina Amlon, and Aubrey's been kind of deep in, if you will, right, his world. And it was time to kind of touch base and, do a bunch of podcasts, do some deep study, meet with Paul, vision, right, the pieces of the next, publishing unfolding that need to be visioned, right? Aubrey has begun World Philosophy and Religion Press. So all of that kind of creates my background here, just to kind of locate kind of where we are. Okay, I'm insanely excited to do this conversation today, right? It's an unusual topic. It's an unusual topic. It's one where we don't generally spend time. More than one person in our circle, right, wrote me and said, God, why would we talk about channeling? Won't that kind of ruin our credibility to talk about the important things that we're talking about in this moment of metacrisis, this articulation of a new story and a new story of value, and this kind of bringing value back into the mainstream conversation, value that's beneath values, evolving value theory, that articulating a new notion of what human identity is, right? A new universe story, right? These essential, inescapable frameworks, which are the frameworks from which culture needs to emerge in order to evolve, to actually evolve the source code of culture and consciousness in response to the metacrisis. Why would you somehow undermine that and talk about channels, right? So you get the implication of the question is not, and I understood the question, like, why would we do that? Why would, right? We're so careful. Well, so I want to really answer that question, right, today in a deep way. Why does this matter? And why is this conversation crucial? And why all voices need to be at the table. So I'm going to turn to David. David's going to resonate our code. And then I'm kind of super excited, honored, and delighted, to be with you. Now, I just want to just do one more minute of check-in. Okay, one more minute of check-in. It's just a hard moment in the world on multiple fronts. It's a hard moment in Ukraine, right, and Russia. It's a hard moment in Sudan. It's a hard moment in Chad. It's a hard moment in Congo. And I know quite a lot about and very close to, in a particular way, the hard moment in Israel. So I'm just deeply aware of that. There are casualties all the time. There are people being killed all the time. There's a live war, right, which was initiated, on October 7th, right, with the horrible massacre at the music festival, the Nova Music Festival, and the brutalities that happened. And, we have actually this very, very tragic face of fundamentalism, which is this kind of culture of death, which is medieval in its context. We haven't seen that kind of culture of death, that kind of, so rampant and so overt, right? In other words, we had these October 7th massacres, and whatever we think about, and I promised, and I will deliver on a larger conversation about what is going on in the Middle East and what's happening there. That's not my conversation now. Just for now, just a narrow bit, right? In other words, it's very rare that you can have the level of brutality and massacre that happened on October 7th and have it embraced, right? Generally, people would deny it. People would say that never happened, or they would say that was aberrant, right? That was some gross violation. We're not in favor of this kind of thing. That's not what's happened. There's been a kind of radical embrace of a level of butchery, right? Intentional, slow, sadistic butchery, right? Performed by Hamas on women as they killed them, right? That's actually unimaginable. And that's been embraced, right, as a legitimate form of discourse, right? That's a horror, right? And things have unfolded from that. And as Israel goes, in many ways, goes the world. So Israel's deeply in my mind. And the need to really understand what's happening there in a deep way, and to understand the suffering of everyone. Right? No one's blood, as I always say, is redder than anyone else's blood. No tears, right? No agony is more agonizing than anyone else's agony, right? So clearly in the Middle East now, we need to hold the agony of every mother and every child and every man and every woman. And we need to actually begin to see how to engage that and how to tell that story. And that's a standing promise I have. I'm waiting for the right time and, for the right moment to address that. Because, my friend Angus and Michael, I don't want to do it casually. I could just talk about it for an hour, but I want to really think through what's the best way I can be of service to you to present this in a way that we can actually, in a relatively short time, get a very deep and new and original and profound understanding of what's happening. So that's just an IOU that I haven't forgotten, and it's on my mind all the time. Okay. So mad love, my friends. Mad love, my friends. David, give us a code. Here we go. Take us inside.
All right, here we go. Here's the code in the chat box. There it is. In this time between worlds and time between stories, we need all voices at the table to respond to the metacrisis. That means the first person of spirit, the second person of spirit, and the third person of spirit. We have excluded the first person voices from the metacrisis conversations. Those voices need to be invited, included, and embraced with discernment and distinction. We must reclaim the enchanted universe in order to respond to the metacrisis. The enchanted includes all the sages, scientists, and seers, politicians and poets, entrepreneurs and ecstatics. All voices from all tables demand clarification and depth, but we cannot afford to exclude any voices, nor do we want to, for indeed, the exclusion of voices is itself one of the root causes of the metacrisis. Back to you, Dr. Mark.
David, thank you. First, it's a delight to see you, David, and a delight to feel your resonance. How wonderful was it to hear David, everybody? And just wonderful to hear David. It's just wonderful to be together. I'm feeling, by the way, everybody, I apologize. I'm feeling just kind of in a sweet and sentimental mode. So I really just want to kind of hang out with y'all by the fireplace and chat and talk and drink wine. But we've got a big and serious topic. Okay, so here we go. We ready? We have a drum roll. Are we ready? Okay, and now we're now stepping in, and we want to actually address this topic in a serious way, right? What is the relationship between the work that we're doing in One Mountain, Many Paths, in the Center for World Philosophy and Religion, right? Which is at this moment of metacrisis, telling a new story of value, articulating a new vision of value theory, a new response to essential questions, right? These simple first principles and first values, which if we iterate them, can actually create a coherently intimate world, right? Borrowing from Turing in morphogenesis, in his classical essay, where he talks about simple first rules that generate coherent complexity in the exterior world. At this moment of breakdown, we desperately need new coherence. We create new coherence at a moment of crisis by actually generating a new vision rooted in a new story of value. It's the breakdown of coherence is rooted in the breakdown of first principles and first values embedded in a story of value. When we lose relationship to first principles and first values embedded in a story of value, we begin to generate reality without those first principles, without that story of value, without those plot lines, and reality collapses, right? It cannot but collapse, because reality is the coherence of reality, of what we call the intimate universe, is based on living from, generating reality from a level of consciousness that is animated by first principles and first values embedded in a story of value. So to the precise extent that we had coherent stories in the past, we created coherence. To the precise extent in the past that our stories were actually flawed, that there were traumatized fictions that entered stories and became part of them, that first principles and first values were ignored or distorted, we created distortion and suffering in the past. But now we're at this unique moment where actually everything's at stake. That's what we mean by a time between worlds and a time between stories. Everything's at stake. So at this moment, if we don't get the plot lines of the story right, if we don't go back to the story, rewrite the story, integrate, weave into the play, right, into the great story of reality, the deepest validated knowings, truths, plot lines of value from the traditional period, from the modern period, and from the postmodern period, from all three, if we don't weave them together, if we leave out any dimension of value, if we leave anything off the table, it's not going to work, right? It's going to fall apart, right? Because you need precisely, if you can kind of feel this, you need precisely all of the first principles and first values in relationship to each other, moving together, moving down the field as a team, a cacophony of first principles and first values. There's never one, right? There's never autonomy. Freedom, that's our principle. It doesn't work. Communion, that's our principle. It doesn't work. Communion becomes shadowy and becomes totalitarianism, and autonomy, right, becomes shadowy and becomes, right, a kind of degraded society with no value at the center, which is its own kind of personal win-lose metrics Western success story. So we can develop kind of shadows of communion will become, for example, communist totalitarianism. Shadows of autonomy will become liberal Western democracy with its own decadences. Both of them have their own joy. They're not equal in any sense. There's not a moral equivalence between those two, right? But that's important to say. Having said that, what we need to do is we need to actually bring, for example, autonomy and communion together, right? We need the first principles and first values to operate together in this larger field. Okay, so that's what we're doing. So what we do every week, right, in this kind of seat of revolution, right? But this revolution meaning we're rebelling against the mediocrities. We're rebelling against, right, a world that's turning away from the need to turn directly into the metacrisis. We're rebelling against the doomers who kind of say it's all over. We're already in doomsday mode. Joanna Macy is a good example, right? My friend Michael Dowd was a good example. There's quite a few thinkers like that. But we're also rebelling against the deniers, right? And whether they're deniers in name, they deny the metacrisis, or they pretend to acknowledge it, but effectively deny it in their actions. I think Sam Altman from ChatGPT-3, GPT-4, whatever it's up to now, is a good example of that, right? He kind of mouths kind of some respect for the metacrisis, but actually acts directly against that respect. Right? We're actually saying, no. The metacrisis is real. The potential threat of the death of humanity or the death of our humanity is absolutely real, and we can respond. How do we respond? We actually iterate new first principles and first values, but not by declaring them, not by making them up, by actually plunging into the depth of gnosis and all the fields of gnosis in the world and weaving them together in this new set of first principles and first values embedded in a story of value. Okay. Now, I know there's a whole bunch of you thinking, why is he repeating all that, right? We've been here. A lot of us have been here. So first off, I'm repeating it for the new people, but two, I'm repeating it for me, right? To locate myself. We have to locate ourselves every week. That's what we do. It's a practice. Sometimes when we study, we're not studying for information, but to be formed, where we form ourselves again, right? I meditate every day. I pray every day. I chant every day. Why? Right? And I relocate myself in reality every day in order to know what context I'm living and moving from. Okay? So with that in mind, here we go. It's absolutely true that in general, people don't see any relationship between the world of channels and the world of articulating a new story of value in response to the metacrisis. And in fact, generally there's not. You know, all too often the world of channeling as it appears today, right, is involved in servicing a kind of upper class dispensable income population that has change to spare and that wants to be spiritually moved by or entertained by, right, or engaged by, right, the worlds beyond, right? So clearly there's a dimension of channeling which has become marketed and commodified, right, which we have no time for. I'm not interested in engaging. The critique is obvious, but that's not just true about the world of channeling. That's true about the world of wisdom. It's true about the world of Dharma as well. There are commodified versions of both Dharma and channeling that deserve severe critique. I'm not addressing those. Okay, that's a given. Okay, that's a given. Two, but there's also a very rich, not just human tradition of channeling, right? There's actually a contemporary tradition of channeling, you know, beginning with Seth and with Jane Roberts and, you know, an entire, you know, Michael, right? There's an entire world in the last, I don't know how long, the last 40, 50 years, 60 years of channeled entities, right? The Course of Miracles, right, is a channeled book, right, that have actually spoken, at least in part, important truths, attracted audiences that they actually delivered important gifts to, right, in a particular way, in a particular form, right, that was important, that was transformative, right, that actually added gnosis, that actually added goodness, that added truth, that added beauty to the world. And yet those two worlds, right, seem to be two different worlds. So let's start with the beginning. Number one, the Torah itself. So in the Solomon lineage, the book called the Torah, I'm going to use this just as an example. That book, according to the classical lineage, is a channeled document, right? And it was channeled by Moses. And the way the lineage describes the document's emergence in a number of third century texts is that document was channeled by Moses, and Moses literally took it down as dictation. So he's hearing a channeled divine, a clarified divine voice, and Moses writes dictation. That's a classical description of a channel. Now, that experience that Moses had, and this is unique and important, wasn't a singular lone experience of Moses. There was a public experience in the description of the lineage of a theophany, right? That is to say, of a revelation, right? There was actually a communal experience, right, of a profound, unmistakable, self-evidently valid explosion of spirit, of infinity disclosing itself to finitude. And there was an experience that we have just seen, tasted, we've seen the voices, we've heard the lightning, as the description goes, a kind of synesthesia, right? All of our senses are altered, our cells are altered. And that group of people, those millions of people who were at this moment of theophany, right, had an experience which was Think of a near-death experience. So imagine the ultimate near-death experience in which your life is utterly changed and nothing that ever happens to you is even vaguely approximating the depth of reality and goodness of that experience. Okay, so Moses's channel happens in the context of that experience. That's one experience in history. But for our purposes, I just want to note that originating document of the Solomon lineage is a classically channeled document. Now let's go deeper. Okay, ready to go deeper, everyone? So that experience that Moses has is an experience which is called prophecy. Now, prophecy begins before Moses. There's in the lineage a history of prophecy where one of the key prophets is Noah's son, Shem. As an anti-Semite, so Semites is Shem, the son of Noah, who is 10 generations after Adam. Now, I'm not interested here in a bracket for a second. I'm not interested here in adjudicating the question. This is a bracket of the historicity of these particular scriptures. That's not even important. In other words, within the lineage itself, within the classical Solomon lineage itself, there are different schools, and one which understands this as a historical narrative, and others who understand it as an archetypal narrative, right, as a kind of movement of collective sacred archetypes, right, there who understand it as a mythic narrative, but not mythic in the sense of not being true. It's not less than history, it's more than history. There's others who understand it as both. It's both mythic, it's both archetypal, and it's historical. So I'm going to bracket that issue. That's simply not our issue here. I'm going to speak about this in general terms, and you can interpret it as mythic, archetypal, right, or historical, but all of those are forms of valid truth. They're all speaking to something which is fundamentally true. So in the lineage, Noah's son, Shem, S-H-E-M, is a prophet. Some of you may be familiar with one of the places where Noah's son Shem appears, right, in history. He appears in a key pivotal meeting with Abraham, right, who's one of the first patriarchs of, well, he's the formal first patriarch of the Solomon lineage. There are 4 powerful women and 3 powerful men who are filled with potency and vitality and aliveness, and they're called the mothers and the fathers, the patriarchs and the matriarchs. The first is Abraham, and Abraham has a pivotal meeting with Melchizedek, right? Who's ever heard the name Melchizedek? And in English, I know in spiritual circles, they pronounce it in some weird way, Melchizedek or something like that, right? That's the worst Hebrew pronunciation in the world, Melchizedek. Okay, but Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is both a king, Malki means king, Melech, king, right? He's also a prophet, right? He's considered to be this Shem, the son of Noah. He's a prophet, and he's a priest. So Melchizedek is this very important figure in that he brings together, right, the kingdom, which is politics, engagement in world, priest, which is ritual, practice, right, and prophecy, which is this direct channel. Now, I just want to say it now clearly, the prophet is a channel. So the history of the Solomon lineage particularly, I want to just use this as an example, right? I could talk about this from the perspective of Kashmir Shaivism and from the perspective of early Buddhism, or perspective of early Islam, from the perspective of early and later Christianity, from the perspective of some of the Aboriginal traditions. I'm picking the Solomon lineage so you can kind of get how this works, because it's root lineage for us. Right, so let me just kind of see how this works. Okay, you with me, everybody? So the prophet is a channel, right? That's clear. The prophet is a Navi in Hebrew, Navi, N-A-V-I, right? Navi. Yes, those are also the people that are in James Cameron's movie Avatar. The Navi are the native people, right, on Pandora, right? And Navi, and it's not by accident that Cameron chose that word, because Navi means those who speak the word of God. Niv, the word Niv, right, is the word that comes through the lips, right? So the prophet is a channel for the word of God. It's a very, very dramatic idea. That's what the prophet is. And the entire history of prophecy, right, beginning with, let's say, Shem, who's Melchizedek, and then Abraham, the first patriarch. Abraham is both a prophet, right, and a warrior prince. And those two go together. So Abraham is accessing directly the divine word in communication, right? There's this I thou between, there's a conversation between Abraham and the divine. That's one dimension of prophecy, a conversation. Number two, there's a message, right? And number three, there's a channel, right? Abraham actually writes down the divine word. And as we said earlier, the Torah itself is understood to be a channel. And I want to make this even more clear to you. So let me go to the next step. So you may be familiar with the fact that the classical Torah of the Solomon lineage, right, which grounds at least what are called the three great faiths, right? Is Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And there's many sources that talk about the relationship between the Torah and the East, but that's not for now, right? Specifically mediated through Solomon. That's a bracket. But this original founding document called Torah has 5 books called the 5 books of Moses. Okay. The fifth book is, you with me, everybody? The 5th book is Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy, a Latin term, is in Hebrew Devarim. Devarim is from the word davar, D-A-V-R. It means the word. Elu hadvarim. These are the words, Asher Diber Moshe, which Moses spoke. So Moses speaks the word. The word is an important word. It's a very important word. The word is the monad. The word is the logos. And the word, davar, D-A-V-A-R, also means thing. So thing and word are the same, meaning there is not a world only of matter, thing. The thing is the word. The davar is the davar. So, for example, the 10 commandments are actually in Hebrew the aseret, the 10 devarim, dibrot, the 10 words. So the 10 words are the animated words. These are the words that Moses spoke. Now, here's the problem. Aren't these 5 books, we call them the 5 books of Moses, but actually these are also understood to be Devar Adonai, the word of God. So one second, this is confusing. If this is the word of God, if the entire point of the Solomon lineage is that we have this Torah, this sacred document of instructions for living, right, of light, right, of illumination, which is the word of God. So A, why do we call them the 5 books of Moses? Why don't we call them the 5 books of God? Let's start there. But more specifically and more dramatically, and this is where I want to focus, the 5th book actually begins with, these are the words that Moses spoke, not that God spoke. So if these are the words that Moses spoke, why is this God's book? This is Moses's book. Okay? Moses is good. So the lineage engages this very deeply. And the Zohar, 13th century, the book of radiance, explains, I'm going to use the Aramaic, Shchinte dabre mi pumei de Moshe. The Shekhinah, she, Eros value, the goddess, the word, speaks to the lips of Moses. So Moses is a channel, right? The Shekhinah, that the divine voice speaks through Moses. Now, stay close. So in the lineage, and in the great lineages of all the traditions, but it's actually most subtle, most nuanced, and most humanistically articulated in the Solomon lineage. Right? It's actually far more problematic, actually, in certain expressions of Christianity, Islam, Vajrayana Buddhism, etc. Right? There's a deep humanist realization in the Solomon lineage, which is one of the reasons why it's so important. And it's also a potential frame, or one of the important sources that resource, right, a world religion as a context for our diversity. But you can find expressions of this somewhere in all of the great traditions. It's more pronounced, it's more central, right, in the Solomon lineage. But you can find it in certain texts in Sufism. You can find it in certain texts in late Buddhism, right, etc. Okay, but I'm focusing now on the Solomon lineage. So, Shchinte dabre mipumei de Moshe, the Shekhinah speaks through the lips of Moses. So what does that mean? So one approach of both the Solomon lineage and all the lineages is Moses got completely out of the way. He got completely out of the way. Moses, there was no Moses. Moses's greatness is his capacity for what's called bitul, B-I-T-T-U-L, self-nullification. There's no Moses. Moses is so empty. You with me? Moses is so empty that the voice can speak through Moses. And the image, of course, that's always used is a kind of wind instrument, right? Which is purely empty. And so the music, the voice, right, the sound vibrations move through the empty instrument. However, deep within the Solomon lineage, and actually the articulation that was apparently Solomon's himself, and it's transmitted generation to generation, and it goes ultimately to a figure named Lainer, L-A-I-N-E-R, living in the mid-19th century, who's the receiver of, right, almost 3,000 years of lineage tradition, explains it differently. And what he says, based on what he received, based on the deep lineage, he says, well, and he's using words not as magic, but just as a way of explaining. He says, spell Moses backwards. So Moses is Moshe, right? If you spell Moses backwards, Moshe is Hashem, the name. So the name, Moses is the name. So what does it mean, the name? So the name means, and it's very profound, it's very beautiful, right? The name means that Moses is so present. There's so much Mosesness, right? Moses is so full. The fullness of Moses is so obviously apparent that Moses's radical subjectivity, his radical unique subjectivity, melts into, merges with, discloses as the divine. And Moses becomes ontically identified. There's an ontic, O-N-T-I-C, ontic meaning for realsy, ontological. Moses is ontically identified. There's an ontic identity of wills and voices between Moses and the divine. So the channel in this vision not only becomes empty, no, the channel empties in stage one of anything that's superficial, because the opposite of the superficial is the holy. The opposite of the sacred, right, is superficiality, surface. Depth is sacred. The shallows is the superficial. Moses empties himself in stage one of anything that's not of his name, and then he becomes the ultimate artist of self-creation, and he writes his letter, his unique letter in the cosmic scroll, and that unique letter is Moses, Hashem, the name. And Moses' uniqueness is therefore not merely his ability to get out of his own way, to bracket himself. That in the deep Solomon lineage, directly to Solomon, that is just the first stage. But then in the second stage, he's utterly filled with his irreducible quality of unique individuation of the divine field. Right? Moses is the expression of Metatron, and Metatron is Enoch, who becomes God in chapter 5 of the book of Genesis. Metatron is the man-woman God. It's the human become God. It's apotheosis. It's the possibility of the human being to clarify the voice so precisely that I participate in the divine field. Right? I become a God voice. So that's prophecy. I mean, that's deep, right, my friends? That's deep. And that's the origination, right, of the lineage. And all through the early biblical period, if you will, the period of the canon, right? The period of the prophets, right? All through that period, at the very center, we have this vision of the prophet. And the temple that is enacted in Jerusalem as in temple conscious and temple energy, that temple is enacted by the prophets. But the prophets, and now it gets very critical, the prophets also hold with them, they're also in relationship to a body of material which originates with the infinite, mediated through the fullness of the prophet in their anthro-ontological experience, anthro-human being, ontological, the capacity of the human being to perceive the mystery, to channel the mystery through our fullness, through a combination of our emptiness and fullness. Right? The prophet articulates sacred texts, and these sacred texts are texts of ethos and texts of eros and ethos. And what is eros? Eros is the experience of radical aliveness, desiring ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness. That's the movement of eros. And eros implicitly is ethos, because the desire for contact demands ethos, and ever greater wholeness demands right relationship between the parts, a deep fairness, a justice, a harmony, right? A possibility, right, of profound, intimate communion, in which everything is in right relationship to everything else, and no voices are split off, and no parts of self are split off, and no nations are split off, and no people are split off, and no sexual orientations are split off, and no one's demonized, right? So we move from this place of the demonized, right, to the daemonized. We're all called, right, by a shared meaning. And so the prophet channel is always in relationship to, the prophet channel is always in relationship to a sacred body of text, which is a text of ethics. It's a prophetic text of perfecting the world as ethos, freeing the slaves, giving voice to the oppressed, liberating the downtrodden, right? Creating wholeness, meeting and transforming shadow. So the channel never lives independently of a normative text of ethics with a set of ethical demands. And in Buddhism, they would call that the Eightfold Path, right? So in Buddhism, okay, ready for a leap? In Buddhism, the first person happens in the meditative space. So in Buddhism, the first person happens not in speech, not in the speech of the channel, but in the silence of the master meditating. But it's still a first person voice, right? Meditation itself, the realization, the kensho, or the satori of meditation, is a first person experience, and it requires relationship to a body of ethos. And that's called in Buddhism the Eightfold Path, for example. Now, in the Solomon lineage, right, what's critical is it begins with the silence, but then out of the silence emerges the word. And the word is the Niv, N-I-V, right? It's the word spoken by the lip of the prophet. The prophet is the one who articulates the word. It's the word that emerges from the silence. So the prophet's a channel articulating the word that emerges from the silence, the word that is engaging the marketplace, that's engaging the polis, right? That's engaging society, that seeks the transformation of reality, right? That seeks to transform earth into the abode of heaven, that seeks to create Jerusalem on a shining hill, right? That seeks to actually create not Savitia's day, not Augustine's city of God, dissociated and alienated, right, from the enfleshed world, but a world in which the enfleshed is the logos. The enfleshed is the voice of the divine, in which we can actually experience mipsari from the flesh. Echazeh Eloha, right? I vision the divine. Now stay close, So this experience of channel is always in direct relationship with a profound body of ethos. Now, at some point, the temple is destroyed. Now, the temple that we put on the table like 7 or 8 minutes ago is the place in which, at the center of the temple, is the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant resides in the Sanctum Sanctorum, in the Holy of Holies at the very center of the temple. And as we've talked about here before, above the Ark of the Covenant are 2 cherubs, not of the hallmark variety, 2 cherubs, 2 innocent angels. They're called babyface to express their dimension of innocence. These beings of innocence locked in passionate embrace. And then the priest enters the temple, first modeled by Moses, who's the prophet. And the priest accesses, the prophet accesses, each in different ways, the divine word, which speaks from between the cherubs. So the temple itself is a place of revelation. It's a place of miracle. Miracle from the root word in Latin, mirare, behold with rapt attention, and you will see the explosion of infinity, right? Laced, suffused all through finitude. So the temple is a place in which natural order can be suspended, in which divine voices, right, play from between sexually intertwisted cherubs, where if we listen carefully, right, we hear the voice of the prophet. We hear the voice of the miracle. And at some point, the temple is, and the destruction of the temple is about a movement in history to a new era. The temple coexists with paganism. And paganism is, in its own way, the wild voice of the miracle, or of the explosion of infinity into finitude. It's the voice of channels, but paganism all too often allowed the ecstasy of the voice to be dissociated from the field of ethos. And that was the great conflict between the pagans and the prophets. The prophet said, we first have to be good, and our wholeness has to come from our goodness. And the pagan often said, let's at least experience ourselves in our full aliveness. That's where we feel whole. And let the good be subservient, right, to that ecstatic experience of aliveness, which for us is wholeness. And the prophet said, no. The prophet said, it's about the widow. It's about the orphan. It's about the details of your paying attention to shadow and transforming that shadow. It's about being able to clarify your internal voice. It's about the heroics, right, of self-edification, self-refinement, the gorgeousness of ethos, the mother, right, who takes care of her baby and suckles her baby, right, is the image, right, of the prophet. And so there's this pagan prophet, great debate, great conflict, but both paganism and prophecy embrace the first person voice. That first person voice, when the temple is destroyed, is not only challenged, it deliberately goes underground, and something new emerges. And that something new is going to take the stage, the center stage of history for the next couple of thousand years. And that's something new. I'm going to give it a couple of names. One name is Dharma. The axial religions emerge and take center stage, and they gradually focus on sacred texts which are articulating the intrinsic rightness of reality. And even if they don't use these words, whether it's the pre-Socratics who are a few hundred years before the temple's destruction, but their full influence is felt afterwards. The temple, by the parentheses, is destroyed 70 years after what's given as the time of Christ's crucifixion. So it's in the year 70 Common Era. Right? The pre-Socratics are several hundred years before the Common Era, but their influence, it only begins to be fully felt, right, in the first millennium, right, of the Common Era. And so the pre-Socratics and the actual religions in their development, in their unfoldings, they move away from the first person voice and they begin to try and articulate a field of value. They begin to try and articulate principles, first values, right? And ethos. And I would call those the interior sciences. Those are when I refer to the interior sciences, I'm referring to much more than that, but not less than that. Those are the classical interior sciences. And at the same time, the exterior sciences begin to emerge, right? The exterior sciences take a momentous leap forward in the Renaissance, but science doesn't begin with the Renaissance, right? The great Aristotelian move of classification is several hundred years before the Common Era, right? Aristotle, Plato, after the pre-Socratics. There's this desire to classify, to organize, to probe, to explore, right? To understand. So there's this emergence of the classical sciences, the exterior sciences, which in the Renaissance, right, will explode into modern science because in the Renaissance, there's this movement from classification to measurement, right? We move from classification to measurement. Galileo, Kepler, they begin to measure, and measurement gives us access to these other vast possibilities that generate all of the dignities of modernity in their best forms. Let's bracket now their shadow forms that we've talked about. But that's the movement of science. And the movement of interior sciences also explodes in the Renaissance with the emergence of human rights, universal human rights, and justice, and the emergence of the feminine. So these two great emergences. Now stay close. We're just going to go 3 more minutes. And then what happens? Science marches forward, right? Classical philosophy, universal human rights takes center stage, at least in a large part of the world, far from all of it, but a large part of the world. And classical science, with its new power of measurement, thrusts forward. And the power of measurement of classical science is so unimaginably potent. It produces immediate results. Those results are commodifiable, meaning they generate resource, money, and power immediately. And this very intimate relationship gets established between industry, technology, power, and science. And so science focuses on the measurable and that which can be priced. And the priceless and the immeasurable begins to get lost. And the interior sciences grind to a halt. After the establishment of universal human rights, the process stops. We forget to ground these universal human rights in a field of value. We just establish them, we declare them. We hold these truths to be self-evident, the founding documents of the American Constitution. We don't ground them in a field of value. We bypass the issue of value. As I've said many times, we took a loan of social capital just to assume value in modernity, but we never articulate a source and ground of value. And so what happens is the exterior sciences march forward. The interior sciences grind to a halt somewhere after the Renaissance and the Western Enlightenment, right? A couple hundred years later, with the birth of democracy. And then something new happens. And with this, I end. Right? As we feel, we're going to pick up next week, but as we feel the world becoming disqualified, Lewis Mumford talked about the disqualification of the universe. We feel the world becoming disenchanted, right? The measured world, the industrial world marches forward, and every moment of time is commodified and measured. And we lose access to value. We lose access to quality, to qualia. We lose access to the depths of spirit and first person knowing. We lose access to to Eros itself. And ethos becomes a given, but without ground in Eros. What begins to happen is new voices begin to emerge, channels again, prophets again, right? New voices emerge in the Solomon lineage. It's called Hasidism. The entire Hasidic tradition, which begins with the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name, is this explosion of a kind of new prophecy. Romania, at the same time, right? Romania is the place from which the Baal Shem Tov emerged. Romania is this place of wild mystics and prophets. Europe, right, is filled with and is afraid of. And the frenzy of the witch burnings was the fear, right, of this direct access, this reemergence, right, and of course the witch burning kind of begins 300-400 years earlier, but it's about this same movement, this underground movement that hadn't yet broken forward, so it's underground, which is this direct access, this voice is speaking through me, and they were understood as being in opposition to ethos, and they challenged the power of the establishment, so they were crushed brutally, but they reemerge again. They reemerge again in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And again, the reemergence of Hasidism and the Solomon lineage is a reemergence of the channel, right, of the prophet. And actually, you can begin to trace all over the world the beginning of the reemergence of these voices, these channel voices. And they're important voices, but they need to be clarified. They need to be clarified. They need to be in relationship to a body of ethos. They need to be in relationship to first principles and first values. And if we have channel voices that are unmoored and untethered, right, then we actually have an entire field of channels which could become echoes of the regressive strains of paganism, which the prophet was standing against. We need to clarify the voice of prophecy. We need to clarify the possibility of the channel. We need to re-embrace and re-enchant reality. And that means that we need to bring the first person voice back into the conversation. So I'm going to hold here. I'm literally going to hold right here just to end it, end on time. But we're going to pick up this exact conversation next week. This is part 1 of 2. This is just to begin to set the stage, right? We're just beginning to set the stage. What a crazy honor to be together. What a crazy pleasure. What a crazy joy. Right? And does everyone get why this is important? A conversation we've never had before. So it's a new conversation. We've just begun it. Critically important. We need first-person voices in engaging the metacrisis. And we need first-person voices, right? The channel, the prophet, the artist, the muse, right? In actually engaging the fullness of our lives. And it's only the fullness of our lives. It's only from the fullness of our lives that we will engage the metacrisis. Mad love.